On Christmas Day, I decorated the house in Lake Oswego just the way my late wife Eleanor always loved it. The scent of rosemary roast beef and garlic filled the air. Mashed potatoes sat creamy and smooth in a porcelain bowl, and the pecan pie was cooling by the window. This was my first Christmas without Eleanor. She passed away 5 months ago, and all I wanted was to have my son Ethan and his wife Chloe at my table. I set out the fine china, lit the candles, and waited. But instead of the familiar sound of their car crunching on the gravel driveway, a courier in a red windbreaker walked up my porch steps with an envelope. Inside was a note, a message that made one thing painfully clear. They had not forgotten me. They had deliberately chosen to be somewhere else. The young man could not have been more than 20. He had that impatient look of someone with 20 more stops to make before he could finally go home. He handed me the envelope, nodded once, and was gone. The crunch of his shoes on the frosted path was the only sound until the low cough of his car's engine carried him away. I stepped back into the hallway, the note in my hand. It was Chloe's handwriting, small and perfectly looped. Arthur, we decided to spend Christmas at my mom's this year. Hope you understand. Love, Chloe. That was it. No Merry Christmas. No offer to see me later in the week. My gaze drifted to the dining room, glowing under the chandelier. The meal I had spent 2 days preparing sat waiting. I poured a glass of iced tea and sat at the head of the table alone. The roast beef was tender, but it might as well have been cardboard. My throat tightened, and after a few bites, I set my fork down. The food tasted of absence. Later I picked up my phone, more for the distraction than anything. I scrolled through my feed, and there it was. A post from Chloe's mother. A long, crowded table, wine glasses catching the light, faces bright with laughter. At the far end, Ethan sat next to Chloe, his hand on hers, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. The caption read, "So grateful for a house full of family this Christmas." Grateful. The word landed like a stone in my chest. I stared at the picture until the screen went dark. For years, our house had been the heart of Christmas. Now, it was just a quiet, well-decorated stage for a play that had been canceled. I put the phone face down and looked at the empty chair beside me, where Eleanor's knitting basket still sat. As I packed the uneaten feast into containers, I realized the cold, hard truth. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been replaced. The morning after Christmas was colder than the day before, not in temperature, but in the profound silence that had settled over the house. I woke early, though I hadn't really slept. The tree lights were still on, casting a soft, lonely glow over the living room. It made the house look like a photograph of a life, pretty but frozen in time. I pulled on a sweater and stepped outside, my hands shoved deep into my pockets. The morning air bit at my cheeks, crisp and sharp. I found myself walking the old stone path to the garden, a path Eleanor had walked every morning. The bird feeder, a small wooden house she'd insisted on, hung from the maple tree, empty and swaying gently in the breeze. She used to say, "They still need to eat, Arthur, even when no one else is watching." On an impulse I didn't understand, I reached up to check it. My fingers brushed against something wedged between the post and the roof. An envelope. It was slightly weathered, but the flap was sealed. My name was on the front, just Arthur, in Eleanor's unmistakable script. My breath caught. In the corner was a date from 1 week before she died. I carried it back inside and sat at the kitchen table, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. The paper inside was folded neatly. "If you're reading this," it began, "something has happened that I hoped wouldn't go to my desk, the top drawer. There's more." Her desk in the study had been untouched for months. I knelt and pulled open the top drawer. Beneath the stationery and notepads, my fingers caught on the edge of another envelope, taped to the underside. A small brass key was clipped to it. Inside was a legal deed and another note. "Arthur, if Ethan ever shuts you out, this will make sense. You'll find everything you need at the place this key opens. It's yours. It always was. You just didn't know it." I stared at the deed. It was for a small cabin in Welch's, Oregon, under my name alone. She knew. She had seen this coming. The drive to Welch's was a blur of bare trees standing like sentinels along the road. The address led me down a gravel path to a small white house with blue shutters and a stone porch. It looked settled, like it had been waiting. The key slid into the lock as if it had come home. The air inside was warm, scented with cedar. Everything was neat, cared for. On the mantel were photos of us, and on the coffee table, a final folded note. "This is yours," it read, "in case they ever forget who you are." I sank into an armchair by the window. She wasn't just talking about a house. She was talking about my worth, my place. She hadn't just left me a property. She had built me a refuge. Back in my own house, the quiet felt different. It was no longer the sound of loneliness, but of contemplation. The brass key to the cabin sat on my desk, a solid piece of evidence that I was not imagining things, that Eleanor's love was as tangible as metal. Her notes were tucked safely in my wallet. I knew I couldn't just sit on this knowledge. Action was required. I spent the rest of the day carefully going through Eleanor's study. This time, I looked for anything out of the ordinary. In the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet, tucked behind old tax returns, was a folder labeled Household Private. Inside, I found copies of insurance statements and a list titled Accounts Arthur. One entry stood out, a trust account managed by a Catherine Vance. Beside the name, Eleanor had written in parentheses, "Ask Frank if needed, in case of trouble." I picked up the phone and called Frank Peterson. I told him about the cabin, the notes, and the folder I'd just found. When I mentioned Catherine Vance's name, there was a brief silence on the other end. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a low whistle. "Eleanor didn't miss a trick. Catherine Vance is a dispute consultant, Arthur. She's the person you hire when you expect a fight, and you want to win it before it even starts. She's sharp, she's tough, and she doesn't bend. If Eleanor put you in her hands, she was giving you an arsenal." He was right. This wasn't just a backup plan. It was a fortress. "You need to call her, Arthur," Frank urged. "Today." "Oh." Before I could, trouble came to my door. Ethan's silver SUV pulled into the driveway. He walked up to the porch alone, hands stuffed in his pockets, wearing a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Dad," he said, stepping inside. "Thought I'd stop by. We haven't talked since Christmas." "We could have," I said, leaning against the doorframe, "if you'd been here." He winced but recovered quickly. "Right. Well, I was in the garage the other day and saw some boxes of paperwork. Figured maybe you could use a hand sorting through it all." There it was, the opening move. He wandered into the living room, looking around as if he were assessing the property. "You know," he continued, his tone casual, "we've been reading about how vulnerable older folks can be to mistakes or scams. Chloe and we just want to help you manage things." I watched him, my expression unreadable. "For you, perhaps it isn't, but from where I'm sitting it looks a lot like you're trying to take over before you're invited to." He ran a hand through his hair. "Dad, it's not like that. We just don't want things to get messy down the line." "Messy for whom, Ethan?" I asked. He didn't have an answer. He stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. "All right, I'll see you soon then." I walked him to the door. As he left, I saw Chloe in the passenger seat, phone pressed to her ear, not even glancing at the house. This was a reconnaissance mission. They were testing the waters, and I had just shown them the ground was firmer than they thought. The knock on the door wasn't friendly. It was sharp, official, the kind that expects an answer. I opened it to find a man in a beige windbreaker holding a clipboard. "Arthur Morgan?" he asked, not meeting my eyes. I nodded. "I'm here to deliver a notice from the county court. You'll want to read it carefully." He handed me a thick envelope and was gone before I could ask a question. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart a slow, heavy drum. Inside was a petition. Petition for guardianship, filed by Ethan Morgan and Chloe Morgan. I read the lines, and the air in my lungs turned to ice. They claimed I was no longer capable of managing my personal or financial affairs due to declining cognitive function. They had listed examples: an unpaid utility bill I had corrected the next day, a supposed confusion with banking passwords, and an incident of leaving the stove on a story fabricated from whole cloth. Half of it was lies. The other half were simple, honest mistakes twisted until they looked like evidence of decay. I didn't wait. I didn't sit in shock. I walked to the phone and called Catherine Vance. I read her the first paragraph. "They've moved faster than I expected," she said. her voice calm and sharp. Guardianship petitions are dangerous, Arthur. They're easier to get than most people think, especially if the court believes you're isolated. I'm not isolated, I said, the words feeling like a vow. No, she replied, but they're building a picture where you are, and unless we get ahead of it, that picture becomes reality in the court's eyes. By noon, I was in her office. The petition spread between us. They even listed the cabin, I said, tapping the last page, claiming it's at risk of neglect. Catherine made a note. This isn't just about your independence, she said. They want to unlock the assets attached to that cabin, probably as collateral for something else. She stood and crossed to a filing cabinet. This is what we do now, she said, pulling out a folder. We create our own paper trail. A trail so thick and clear it makes theirs look like a child's scribble. She laid out the strategy. First, medical clearance proving you're competent. Second, documented records of you managing your own accounts. Third, witnesses who can testify to your clarity and decision-making. If we give the court a stack of evidence thicker than theirs, she said, her eyes meeting mine, we win before the hearing even starts. Our first stop was my doctor's office. Dr. Keller had been my physician for 20 years. He greeted me with a warm handshake and listened patiently as I explained the situation. He gave me a quick exam reflexes, a series of memory questions, a short writing test. When it was done, he leaned back in his chair. Arthur, you're as sharp as I've ever seen you. This is nonsense. I need you to put that on paper, Doc, I said. Consider it done, he replied, already turning to his computer. I'll draft a letter certifying that you have full cognitive and decisional capacity. I'll have it notarized. You'll have it by the end of the day. Leaving his office, I felt the first real shift since this all began. They had fired their first shot, but I had just loaded my own gun, and the ammunition was the undeniable truth. Dr. Keller's letter arrived the next morning, a single, powerful page of notarized certainty. With it in hand, my next stop was the bank. Mrs. Alvarez, the branch manager, had known my family for years. She'd overseen the loan for my first car and had given Ethan a lollipop when he was just a boy opening his first savings account. She greeted me with a warm, knowing look. Arthur, she said, leading me into her office, I had a feeling I'd be seeing you. What do you need? I explained the situation, and her expression hardened. Family trouble is the worst trouble, she said, her voice low. Let's pull your records. For the next half hour, we went through 6 months of my financial life. Every check I'd written, every bill I'd paid online, every deposit I'd made in person. It was all there, a clear and undeniable record of my competence. I can draft a letter for you, she offered, stating that you are the sole and active manager of your accounts and have shown no signs of confusion or mismanagement. I've seen you in here every month, Arthur. You're sharper than half my staff. She printed the transaction logs and signed the letter with a firm, confident hand. Another brick in the wall Catherine was helping me build. Next, we needed the voice of the community. Catherine had insisted that an objective witness was worth more than a dozen friendly ones. That's when I thought of Mrs. Gable, the head librarian at the Lake Oswego Public Library. I found her at the main reference desk, surrounded by the comforting quiet of books. Mr. Morgan, she said, a genuine smile lighting up her face. I was just thinking about you. Did you ever find that information on the original timber mills in the county? I had spent an afternoon with her just last week, digging through archives for a small personal history project. It was a complex search, full of cross-referencing and obscure records. I did, thanks to you, I said. But I'm here for a different reason today. When I explained, she didn't hesitate. Of course I'll testify, she said, her voice firm. I'll tell the court that you spent 3 hours researching a complex historical topic with a focus and clarity that I wish my college students had. The idea that you're suffering from cognitive decline is frankly absurd. Her support felt like a shield. She was a respected figure in town, a keeper of facts, and her word carried weight. The final piece of the puzzle came that evening. My phone rang, and it was Frank. He sounded agitated. Arthur, you're not going to believe this. I was over at the Ridgeway storage facility, dropping off some old furniture. Saw a silver SUV I recognized. Ethan's, I said, my stomach tightening. And Chloe's, he confirmed. They were moving boxes into a new unit. I was a few rows over, but I heard them clear as day. Chloe was on the phone telling someone, "We just need to secure the cabin papers before the hearing. Once the judge signs off, everything moves fast." I closed my eyes. They weren't just planning. They were actively moving pieces into place, so confident of their victory. "Thank you, Frank," I said, my voice steady. "That's exactly what I needed to know." I hung up the phone and looked at the stack of papers on my desk. The doctor's letter, the bank records, the notes from my conversation with Mrs. Gable. They weren't just chasing smoke, as Catherine had said. They were chasing a ghost, a property that was already beyond their reach. And as they focused on their imaginary prize, they had no idea I was building a fortress around everything else they had taken for granted. The Tuesday evening before the hearing, my phone rang. It was Ethan. "Dad," he began, his voice laced with a rehearsed warmth that felt thin over the line. "We're having a little get-together tomorrow night. Just some friends, neighbors. Chloe thought you might like to come. A chance to clear the air, show everyone we're all on the same page." The invitation was a masterclass in manipulation, a stage set for a play I had no intention of starring in. Catherine's warning echoed in my mind. If they think they're losing, they might try a public play. If I went, any word I said could be twisted. If I didn't, my absence would be presented as proof of my isolation. "Thank you for the thought, Ethan," I said, my tone even. "But I already have plans." "Oh, plans?" He sounded genuinely surprised that my life didn't revolve around waiting for his calls. "What plans?" "I'm helping the guys at the Veterans Center set up for their monthly breakfast," I replied. It was true. I had arranged it that afternoon. There was a pause. "Oh," he said, the single word heavy with thwarted strategy. "Well, maybe another time." I didn't go to their party. Instead, I spent that evening under the fluorescent lights of the center's community hall, laughing with men who had seen far worse battles than the one I was facing. We unfolded tables, arranged chairs, and debated the proper way to brew coffee for 100 people. Every handshake, every shared story was another thread weaving me back into the fabric of my community, a direct rebuttal to the fiction they were spinning. The next morning my phone rang. It was Ellen from the hardware store. "Arthur," she said, her voice low and laced with indignation. "I went to that party last night. My cousin lives next door to them. You need to know what they're doing." I listened, my knuckles white around the receiver. She described Chloe, moving through the crowd in a bright red dress, a picture of concerned elegance. She'd told anyone who would listen how worried she was. "He's just been having some memory slips lately," Ellen recounted Chloe, saying with a sigh. "We're just trying to get ahead of it, to make sure he's safe." David, Ellen said, stood by her side, looking uncomfortable but never once correcting her. "They were poisoning the well, Arthur," Ellen finished, "making you sound fragile before you even walk into that courtroom." "Thank you for telling me, Ellen," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I wasn't surprised, but hearing it confirmed the coldness of their plan. They weren't just fighting for an asset, they were trying to dismantle my character, piece by piece, in front of the very people whose respect I had spent a lifetime earning. After I hung up, I walked into my study and stood before the desk. The binder sat there, thick with evidence. Doctor's letters, bank statements, witness lists. It was more than just a legal defense. It was the story of my life, written in the undeniable ink of facts. They could perform on their stage of lies all they wanted. My theater was the courtroom, and I was ready for the curtain to rise. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and coffee that had been sitting on a burner for too long. Light filtered in through tall, arched windows, laying long rectangles across the polished wooden benches. I sat at the defendant's table beside Catherine Vance. My hands were folded, my gaze steady on the grain of the wood. Across the aisle, Ethan and Chloe whispered with their attorney, a slick-haired man in a navy suit who looked like an advertisement for easy credit. Chloe's red nails tapped an impatient rhythm on her purse. Ethan kept adjusting his tie, his eyes darting toward me, then quickly away. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a steady, unflinching gaze, took her seat. She scanned the docket, her eyes pausing on me for a moment before moving to the attorneys. "Let's proceed," she said, her voice leaving no room for drama. Their lawyer went first, his voice smooth and rehearsed. Your Honor, he began, my clients are here today out of deep and abiding concern for the well-being of Mr. Morgan. They have observed patterns of erratic decision-making, the selling of valuable assets, and a concerning withdrawal from family. They fear for his ability to manage his own affairs and wish only to be appointed as his legal guardians to ensure his safety and preserve the estate he worked so hard to build. He sat down as if he had just won an award for his performance. Catherine stood slowly, a single, neat folder in her hand. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and calm, my client, Arthur Morgan, has been the target of a calculated attempt to strip him of his autonomy. The patterns the plaintiffs cite are nothing more than the responsible decisions of a competent adult. Their concern is not for his well-being, but for his assets. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She began to build our wall, brick by evidentiary brick. First, she said, placing a document before the clerk, we submit a notarized letter from Dr. Keller, Mr. Morgan's physician of 20 years. She paused, letting the judge read it. It certifies, following a full cognitive assessment last week, that Mr. Morgan is of sound mind and possesses full decisional capacity. I saw Chloe lean over to whisper something to her lawyer, her perfect smile tightening at the corners. Second, Catherine continued, the plaintiffs cite erratic financial decisions. We submit 6 months of bank statements, along with a signed letter from the branch manager of his bank. She slid the next stack across. These documents show, in no uncertain terms, that Mr. Morgan has managed his accounts independently and flawlessly. Every bill paid on time, every check balanced. The judge flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable but focused. The slick lawyer's pen stopped moving. Finally, they mentioned the sale of a vehicle as evidence of recklessness. We submit the official bill of sale for that truck, dated and notarized. The transaction was planned, the price was fair, and the proceeds were deposited directly into Mr. Morgan's savings account. Catherine paused and looked directly at Ethan and Chloe. The only erratic behavior here, Your Honor, is the attempt to manufacture a crisis where none exists. The foundation of their case, built on whispers and twisted truths, was beginning to crack under the simple, heavy weight of documented reality. The judge looked up from the papers, her eyes resting on me once more. The room was silent, waiting for the next piece to fall. Catherine's next move was to call our witnesses. First, Frank Peterson took the stand. In his straightforward, no-nonsense way, he recounted the conversation he had overheard at the storage facility. Yes, ma'am, he said, looking directly at the judge. I heard Mrs. Morgan tell her husband that once they had the papers signed, they could list the cabin and split the money before spring. She said, and I quote, he'll thank us later when he's somewhere safe. A murmur went through the courtroom. Chloe's face went pale with fury, and Ethan sank lower in his chair. Their attorney objected, but the judge waved him off. Then, Catherine called her final witness. The defense calls Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable walked to the stand with the quiet dignity of a woman who has spent her life surrounded by the truth in books. She told the court about my regular visits to the library, but focused on one specific, recent interaction. Mr. Morgan spent an entire afternoon with me researching the history of timber mills in this county, she said, her voice clear and steady. It's a complex subject. He was focused, inquisitive, and his recall of details was better than most graduate students I've assisted. The man I worked with that day was not confused. He was engaged and intellectually sharp. Coming from a respected neutral party, her testimony was devastating to their case. The slick lawyer had no questions for her. Finally, the judge looked at me. Mr. Morgan, is there anything you wish to say? I stood, my hands resting on the table in front of me. I kept it simple. Your Honor, I am 70, 2 years old. I have worked my whole life, served my country, and paid my bills on time. I am not a perfect man, but I am perfectly capable of making my own decisions. My wife and I built that cabin as a place for family, not as a bargaining chip. If my son and daughter-in-law cannot accept that, that is their choice. But they do not get to take away mine. The judge looked from me to them, her gaze lingering for a long, heavy moment. Then she spoke, her voice leaving no room for appeal. Mr. Morgan, based on the credible and overwhelming evidence presented by your counsel and witnesses, I find no grounds whatsoever to grant this petition for guardianship. It is hereby dismissed with prejudice. She wasn't finished. She looked directly at Ethan and Chloe. Furthermore, I am issuing a protective order, preventing the plaintiffs from interfering with Mr. Morgan's property or financial decisions in any capacity. This court strongly advises both parties to seek counseling, though that is a matter of personal, not legal, judgment. Her gavel came down with a clean, final crack. It was over. David's shoulders slumped in defeat. Chloe whispered something sharp in his ear, but he didn't look at her. Their attorney was already packing his briefcase, his performance over, his interest gone. Catherine turned to me, her smile small but triumphant. "It's over, Arthur," she said. Walking out of that courthouse, the winter sun felt warmer than it had any right to be. Frank clapped me on the shoulder. "You held your ground," he said. "Eleanor would be proud." I nodded, my throat too tight for words. Ahead of us, David and Melissa hurried down the steps, their heads close together, a team united only in their shared defeat. They never looked back. The days that followed the hearing were quiet. The victory in court was a relief. A heavy weight lifted, but it left behind an unfamiliar emptiness. The battle was over, but what was I fighting for now? I spent a week in the old house, the silence feeling louder than ever. Ethan and Chloe were gone. They had packed their things and moved into a small rental across town, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their ambitions. I found myself driving to the cabin in Welch's more and more often. One afternoon, sitting on the porch Eleanor had designed, I watched the last of the winter snow melt from the pine branches. The cabin had been my shield. Eleanor had built it to keep me safe. But safety wasn't enough anymore. I needed purpose. Looking out at the quiet woods, I thought of the men I'd served with, men who had come home from war carrying wounds no one could see. They needed a place like this, a place to breathe, to be quiet, to feel whole again without having to explain themselves. The idea took root with a certainty that felt like Eleanor herself speaking to me. This cabin wasn't just my refuge. It could be theirs too. The next day I called Catherine Vance. "I have a new project for us," I said. I explained my vision, to turn the property into a non-profit retreat for veterans and their families, a place for healing, funded by the very trust Eleanor had established to protect me. There was a warmth in Catherine's voice when she replied, "Arthur, I think that's the best use of a legal victory I've ever heard." Spring arrived at the cabin with a quiet persistence, pushing green shoots through the last of the snow. I spent my days there, repairing the old dock, clearing the walking paths, making the place ready. The work was hard on my old bones, but it was honest work, the kind that settles the mind. One Saturday afternoon, as I was sanding the old wooden porch swing, I heard a car coming down the gravel road. It was a modest sedan, not the silver SUV. Ethan stepped out, alone. He looked thinner, and the easy confidence he once wore like a well-fitted coat was gone. He stood at the edge of the driveway for a long moment before walking slowly toward me. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his hands shoved in his pockets. "I heard about what you're doing here. With the vets," Frank told me. I stopped sanding and looked at him. "It felt like the right thing to do," I said. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said, finally looking up. His eyes were clear of the anger and entitlement that had clouded them for so long. "I just wanted to. I'm sorry. For everything. For Christmas. For the things I said. For the hearing." He took a shaky breath. "There's no excuse for it. I was wrong." It wasn't the apology I had imagined, but it was the one I needed to hear. It was simple, and for the first time in a long time it was true. "It takes a strong man to admit that," I said. He looked around at the cabin, at the woods. "Mom loved this place," he said softly. "She would have loved what you're doing with it." We stood there in a silence that wasn't heavy or sharp, but filled with the unspoken history of a father and a son finding their way back. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The first weekend retreat at the cabin was in late June. The air in Welch's was warm and smelled of pine and damp earth. 10 veterans and their families came. We cooked over a fire pit, swapped stories, and fixed the old snowmobile in the shed, even though there wasn't any snow. One evening, a young father, a man who had seen too much in a desert far from these green woods, sat with me on the dock. He told me it was the first time in years he'd felt like his family could simply belong somewhere, without the weight of the world on their shoulders. I didn't say much. I just nodded. But inside, something settled for good. In March, after his apology, Ethan had started coming to the cabin on his own once a month. He didn't ask for anything. He just helped. He'd chop wood, repair a loose shutter, or sit on the porch with me, the silence between us more comfortable than it had been in a decade. He was rebuilding not just the cabin, but himself. Chloe never came, and he never brought her up. Some things I learned heal best when you don't pick at the scab. My life found a new rhythm, one dictated by the needs of others and the quiet satisfaction of purpose. I spent my days at the cabin, my nights back in a smaller, simpler apartment I'd rented in town. The old house in Lake Oswego, now empty, was in the hands of the community land trust Catherine had helped me set up. It would soon be a home for a veteran family, its halls filled with a different kind of laughter. The revenge I had once thought I needed had been quiet, legal, and complete. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was here, on this dock, watching a child who wasn't mine chase fireflies at dusk. It was in the letters I received from the students who had been awarded the Eleanor Morgan Scholarship. It was in the quiet nod from Ethan as we worked side by side, a silent acknowledgement of all that had been broken and all that could still be mended. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Melissa, 3 pages, handwritten. She wrote about her upbringing, about watching her parents fight over property, about a deep-seated fear of insecurity. She admitted she had handled things poorly. She never quite said she was sorry, but she asked if, one day, we could find a way forward. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and put it away. Some things could wait, because sitting here, on a porch that love had built and foresight had saved, I was finally at peace. Laura had known this place had a heartbeat. Maybe she was right. Maybe that heartbeat was what had kept me fighting all along, not for assets or for victory, but for this. For a life that was truly and completely my own. A legacy measured not in what I kept, but in what I chose to give away. The journey through loss and betrayal often leads us to unexpected shores. It teaches us that the strongest walls are not built of anger, but of quiet resolve, and that a true legacy is not defined by the wealth we accumulate, but by the peace and purpose we build for ourselves and for others. The deepest revenge is not to destroy our enemies, but to build a life so full of meaning that their actions no longer have the power to cast a shadow. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. To listen to our next story, click on the playlist now showing on your screen.